Well, welcome. My name is Ernie Dito, and I am hailing from Shenandoah Valley in Harrisonburg, Virginia, and in the United States. And I'm joined today by a co-host for the first time with us, Joshua Sali from Mityana, Uganda, and the Mityana Diocese. Welcome, Joshua. And we are joined today with us. You're watching Everyday Global Anglicans, where today we're going to talk with Reverend Dr. Stephen Noll, and he's coming from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Hello, Dr. Noll.
Morning, good afternoon, good evening.
Yes, that's right. It's late afternoon in Uganda or East Africa. And so now we're going to be referring to you as Dr. Noll for those in the US, but I think in Africa and other places you're referred to as Professor Noll. But we are really privileged to have you here today, because today begins in the Lift Up Your Hearts devotional with Gafcon, and through it. It's a daily weekday devotion that we began in December. And it's for free, and you can subscribe to it by going to gafcon.org. Today, throughout the month of September, on weekdays, Lift Up Your Hearts will be offering a series of devotions on the subject of marriage according to the Book of Common Prayer by Reverend Dr. Stephen Noll. And so we're privileged to have him here. He is a professor emeritus at Trinity School for Ministry and a former vice chancellor of Uganda Christian University. That was for 10 years, was it not?
That's correct.
Yeah. He also serves as a consultant on marriage and the family and the single life for the Anglican Church in North America. And, some might say, might sit up for a second and say, wait a minute, a devotion on marriage? Isn't a devotion supposed to be kind of, high in the sky, real lofty type topics or something like that? I'm just curious, Dr. Noll, I mean, how do you make that happen? You've done 22 days, 22 days, 20 days.
20 days on marriage and 3 days on angels.
That's exactly right, which we're really looking forward to as well. How do you do that? How do you take what you have worked on throughout your life on marriage and turn that into a devotion? Tell us a little bit about what that's going to be like.
Well, I suppose my main thesis is that marriage and also the single life are both forms of Christian discipleship. So if we're talking about spiritual and devotional topics, we're talking about following Jesus. And I think God has given us two very clear avenues by which believers can follow Jesus. And marriage is one of them, a very major part of everybody's life, even those who are not married, who have parents, who have siblings, who have nephews. And then the single life, which is sometimes neglected, and I'll have that in my final week, is another path which Jesus offers to those who would follow him single-mindedly. So I think that's why, in my view, there's obviously a teaching element of that, but then, of course, teaching is also part of discipleship. Jesus said in the Great Commission, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. Well, he has commanded us some things about how to live in the married state and single life. And so we really need to observe his teachings in order to follow him fully.
Well, it's interesting that you said you said that at the last week we'll be dealing with singleness. Sometimes I hear people, theologians, pastors, address strongly marriage, but in a day and age, at least in the West, where there are many singles who are Christians who are asking some profound questions, they often will ignore that. And I think just as needed in the theology of marriage is needed a theology of singleness, what that is like. Can you tell us more your thoughts in that direction?
Well, I might point out that in the Lift Up Your Hearts sessions under Bishop Michael Nazar Ali in July, he was continually referring to the various saints in the calendar of the church year. And in fact, in the calendar for September, we have at least 8 or 10 saints who were single by choice. We would call them perhaps celibate, but they chose to follow Jesus in the single life. And I do think that probably those of us who are out of a Protestant or an evangelical background haven't had much introduction to those who have done that. And of course, there are very famous Protestants, people like John Stott, who chose to live the single life in order to promote his own ministry. And many of the early missionaries who went out for both evangelical and Catholic mission societies were single by choice. But sometimes in our, at least modern Western Protestant culture, we have neglected that part of Jesus' teaching and the history of the church.
Yeah, well, I'm really thankful that you're doing that. I have many friends who are singles, and I think being able to hear that is going to be and to get a deeper understanding of what it means to follow Christ as a single, that you're not, you know, a misfit out there, but this is actually a calling that is just as equally important as being married and having children.
I might mention, I sometimes use the phrase single by choice and single by chance. I mean, even those of us who are married spend considerable parts of our lives as single people. Obviously, as young people before we marry, and then very often at the end of our life as widows or widowers. And then there are those who perhaps sadly don't find the right person to marry. That doesn't mean that life is lost and useless.
Yes, exactly. You know, I think I have just charged headlong into this interview without unfolding a bit more about about Joshua, who's with us. Let me just rewind a little bit so that people can understand a bit about Dr. Noll, your background, as well as introducing Joshua, and you'll see where it all kind of dovetails together. You know, this is what was amazing for me when I went to, I met you briefly in Jerusalem in 2018, Dr. Noll, and then I went with Jesse Parks from ACNA up to Pittsburgh and had a long interview with you that frankly, I began to worry about running out of hard drive space, because it went for about 2.5 hours. And it was just like, there's so much richness here. It's not just the marriage thing. It's, you're doing wed talks, you're doing, you've taught in Uganda. And so I want to rewind a little bit so people can understand the full breadth of who you are. Joshua, as I said, is from Mityana Diocese, and he is all about communications. But he is also a youth leader and worship leader. He loves the Lord. He's in the Uganda Christian University getting his master's in divinity, and was even in the school where you were vice chancellor, correct? Or chancellor?
Yes, correct.
President, but vice chancellor. Is that correct?
That means the same thing.
In Africa. Okay, there was that nuance there. So, Joshua, maybe tell us a little bit about yourself. And actually, I met Joshua in Jerusalem as well. It was a rich, amazing time with Gafcon, and we worked as part of the communications team. That's what people don't realize, and that it's not just a London office or one office out of one of the archbishop's offices. This is a worldwide communion, a global communion, and we want to see more of Joshua's face and some others that are from Nigeria and around the world. Joshua, tell us a little bit about yourself and perhaps some questions related to your time at the Christian University.
Oh, thank you, Ani, and thank you, Professor Noll. Is my Professor Noll because I was our Vice Chancellor. It's great again to be here to share together on this everyday Anglican as we share Christ with everyone in the global South and the whole globe, actually, not just the global South. My name is Sally Joshua, and I've been working in Michiana Diocese for 11 years in the communications office, and now I am doing the youth office in Michiana Diocese, also serving the Lord. But also, I'm grateful to God that I was lucky to attend Uganda Christian University when Professor Noll was the vice chancellor at that time. And it was so great. It's so great to be there. And Professor, oh, by the way, I'm married. I know marriage devotionals will be very great for me. Thank you so much. And
married to one wife, I think.
One Elizabeth. And so I've been also working with the youth in Mukono Diocese and in Michiana Diocese, and it's great. But I just remembered one thing about you in first graduation when I was doing mass communication at UCU. During the graduation, you say, UCU is your alma mater, so you must value it wherever you go because you always carry it with you. The values, the attributes should stand out. And so I'm reflecting on the fact that yesterday was the installation of the new VC after Dr. John Senyonyi.
Yes.
And it's exactly about 10 years since you left that office. What's your experience? How do you share your experience in Uganda as the Vice Chancellor by then?
Well, thank you, Joshua. Actually, this is a very significant anniversary for me and my wife, Peggy, because it was literally 10 years ago today that was my last day. And I kind of remember we had come back to the States maybe 2 days before, so we were back here in the States. But I remember the countdown to midnight, but then it wasn't really midnight. It was like 5 p.m. because midnight Uganda. And I just thought of, all the students who had gone through the universities and that now I was taking that burden and privilege and passing it over to John Senyonyi. And of course, John had worked with me, the Reverend Dr. Canon John Senyonyi had worked with me for 9.5 years during my time. And then he had been selected to succeed me as Vice Chancellor. And now, on August 31st, 2020, he has his last official day where he will be passing on this leadership to Professor Aaron Mushingezi, who is going to be taking over at UCU. So I think if we get to be my age, you tend to count universities by decades or quarter centuries or centuries. And it is a significant day, and we do thank God for the 10 years that we were there and for the 10 years that have continued since then under John Senyonyi.
Well, that's great. When you're taking care of so many youths that walk in, of course, I would say that it's a theological university as well, but you see many youths going on. And now that you're sharing about marriage, it is so interesting that many of your students, some of them by now are married and would be very helpful. What would you share about the devotion in respect to the students or the youth that are going through this time that were your students then?
Right. Well, one of the little talks I used to give to all of the entering students, again, as you say, I mentioned, this university is going to be your alma mater, your dear mother. And I said, you are going to be formed during these 3 or 4 years in many ways. You will be formed professionally, but you'll also be formed as a citizen and as a Christian believer. And you may well meet someone in your classes who will end up being your husband or wife. So look around, because this may be the most important period of your entire life. So they used to laugh, and I was glad because people actually came hoping and wanting someday to be married. So that was the other anecdote I'll add is that in 2007, my wife and I celebrated our 40th wedding anniversary, and it just so happened that that day, August 12th, was a Sunday when I was preaching. So I actually gave a kind of a slideshow and sermon about the nature of marriage, and included some personal, testimonies to my own life. Well, that's 13 years ago, so we had our 50th wedding anniversary just 3 years ago, golden anniversary. Actually, I brought some show and tell. My wife and I put together a book here called Our Golden Book, and you can see that beautiful woman, and she still is, 53 years ago. So
and that's you.
we enjoyed celebrating what God has done in our life and our marriage.
Amen. That was so interesting. It's when we go into the university, we come for a degree, but then sometimes you can come out with a mate and you get married. And so, unfortunately, I wasn't that lucky, but I am married now, so it is good. Yeah.
It's also a time we hoped, and I believe often happened, that people actually became Christians. They were converted to Christ, they gave their life to Christ, and they also accepted a life of deeper discipleship. So when you said, that it was a Christian university or the theological university, what I would say is we considered theology part of life. And so students took basic courses in the Bible, in the Old Testament, New Testament, forming a Christian worldview, ethics from a Christian perspective. And it didn't matter what field you were taking. You could be doing law, you could be doing mass communications, you could be doing social work, and you would be getting this foundation in what it was to follow Jesus. And obviously marriage is one of those places where you live out your discipleship.
Sure.
Well, it's that if someone is talking about marriage or teaching on marriage, it's at this point, at some point, I would have to imagine if we were in a lecture format, for instance, you'd have that person standing up and asking a question. So after 53 years of marriage, Dr. Noll, what's the secret sauce? But let me just ask you that for coming from the perspective, and you're doing this whole series from the perspective of Anglicans, and I should also say you're drawing from Wed Talks. Could you tell us a little bit about Wed Talks and how is this a particular Anglican angle that you are drawing from?
Right. Well, let me just begin actually one step back and talk about Gafcon, because people might say, what's the relevance for Gafcon? And I just went through the Jerusalem Declaration and highlighted several things in these devotions that will be features of Gafcon. For instance, the second clause says, we believe the Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testaments to be the Word of God written and to contain all things necessary for salvation. You'll find in these devotions, I'm constantly going back to the Scriptures. The first few days are looking at the book of Genesis, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, the fall, and then we get to the wedding of Cana. And I think you'll find throughout these devotions, we're actually doing biblical exegesis, just as we did last month with 1 Peter, but this time we're moving to particular passages on that topic. The clause 4 says we uphold the 39 articles. Well, the 39 articles make clear that marriage is a form of life given by God. Then we go to clause 6 says we rejoice in our Anglican sacramental and liturgical heritage as an expression of the gospel. And we uphold the 1662 Book of Common Prayer. There's another one of Gafcon's principles where marriage is involved. Then in clause 8, we say, we acknowledge God's creation of humankind as male and female and the unchangeable standard of Christian marriage between a man and a woman as the proper place for sexual intimacy and the basis of the family. So all I'm saying is when you say, oh, marriage, that's just one little thing. Actually, it's not. It covers a whole lot of areas in which the gospel and in which the Gafcon movement considers important.
Well, and that's interesting. You start from the Gafcon movement in that respect, because you are very much a integral part of the Gafcon movement. You have written a recent book specifically talking about the Gafcon movement. You were there in 2018 when things were being written up. You were one of the principal writers and contributing to that. Tell us about your involvement in all of that. And you do a shameless promo of your book as well.
Well, thank you, Ernie. I will say that perhaps one of the unforeseen blessings of my time in Uganda was that I came to know the global South and particularly Africa and Uganda in a way that I never had before. And that I think maybe gave me some ability and credibility to when the different movements came together. Before I went to Africa, I'd been fighting a kind of rear guard action in the Episcopal Church. And frankly, it was pretty depressing. So when I got to go to Uganda, even though it was kind of a strange call from God, at least I knew I had something positive to do. But then when, of course, the politics of the Episcopal Church and came into the Anglican Communion, I suddenly kind of put the two together. So I was involved in the first Gafcon in Jerusalem, and actually in all three of them, the one in Nairobi and then the one in 2018. And I was on this statement group of all three of those. And so what I've done just this year is write a new book. It's called The Gospel of God and the Church of God, Global Anglican Essays. And it has three essays. The first one is basically an exposition of the first Jerusalem statement and declaration. The second one is, again, a kind of exposition of the statement from 2018 called Letter to the Churches. The third one is a statement put out by a task force on women in the episcopate, of which I was a convener, and we put out a statement, and I wrote a letter about, it's called Women Bishops and Reception. And the question is, how does the church understand and perhaps change its traditional practices and teaching? So I put the three together under the larger question of the gospel of God and the church of God. So that's what I've been working on in terms of my Gafcon writing. But I also am happy to talk about the WED talks, because in the States, in the Anglican Church in North America, I was also chairman of a task force on marriage, family, and the single life. I'm now called consultant. And so in that capacity, I had some input in the writing of a new prayer book liturgy for the Anglican Church in North America. Many of you probably know, but in 2019, again, show and tell, the Anglican Church in North America put out a new prayer book. And it's rather an amazing accomplishment. And it has, again, draws from the traditional 1662 prayer book, but it's also updated with language and with some other ideas. So I was particularly involved in the writing of the Holy Matrimony service. Now, I was not on the liturgy committee that actually wrote it, but I had input into that committee, and much of what I suggested was incorporated finally. So once the marriage service was set, we then decided to produce what we call a marriage presentation booklet. And here's an example. I think you may see it on one of the screens that we have. And it's a very lovely booklet. It's about 25 pages long. And you can give it to couples and clergy and it has the service itself there printed out, and it also has some certificates. For instance, here's one where they can put their names, and it can be kept as a kind of memento. I think one thing that married couples should do is to keep mementos of your wedding, whether it's a video or whether it's a booklet like this, because you need to go back and remind yourself from time to time of what you committed yourself to and the whole life of marriage. So I was involved in producing this, and then the final step was I developed a series of what's called WED Talks. I don't know if you can see that. WED Talks is a CD which I've produced, in which we go through not only the question of what is marriage, but the different parts of the liturgy. So what you're getting this month is partly drawn from my WED Talks, but it's adapted to a wider audience, through the global communion. And so I've taken some things from the WED Talks, and then I've added other things from my experience globally.
Where can you find those materials? All of those materials are incredible. I think that's a really good idea, that book that people can save as a commemoration of the marriage. That's a really good idea. Just saving the cake, a piece of the cake, just really doesn't cut it. That's a much better idea, having something written down and pictures and stuff like that. Where can we find? I put up on the website, on the Facebook page, the people are following the contending Anglican, but is there another place that we could find your book?
Well, yes. It's all being published by Anglican House Publishers in the USA.
Okay.
So if you go to Anglican House Publishers, you can get the prayer book, you can get the presentation booklet, and you can also get my book, The Gospel of God and the Church of God.
Okay. Okay.
Could I make one more intervention here? Because it's true, for the last 2.5 years, I've taken up blogging under the title Contending Anglican, and it's mainly because of the stress within the communion, with the Lambeth Conference coming up, with Jerusalem Conference coming up. But I'm actually migrating that over to a new blog, which is really out now, called StephensWitness.org.
Okay.
STEPHENS witness, all one word, .org. And it will have all the items that are in Contending Anglican, but I'm going to have other items, including WED Talks. I'm going to have an entire section on marriage and family. So I'm not just fighting battles anymore. I'm actually trying to do some other things.
Well, that was actually one of my. Let me just first say that that people from around the world are watching this right now. We have people from India that are sending greetings. We have someone that said hello to Joshua. I've lost that person now, but Granny is Yaku, greetings, sir. I imagine that would resonate with you, Joshua. But yes, we're getting people from all over the world, because what you are watching is Everyday Global Anglicans. This is Gafcon Global Anglicans sponsored interview, where we draw people from all around the communion, and our desire is at Gafcon and with this interview structure is to equip and strengthen the church, proclaiming Christ faithfully. You can go to gafcon.org and subscribe to the devotions that Stephen Noll is providing this month. Next month, we'll have Simon Manchester from Australia. We've had people we're trying to draw from all around the world. We'll have, we already have some people lined up in January and February that are from Egypt and from Pakistan. And we're just excited how this is growing. We're now over 3,000 subscribers, and we encourage you to join in on us with this devotion. That it's structured that we try and keep it to roughly 600 words, and we'll have even a prayer at the bottom of it for you to look at. So you're diving in the Word, you're hearing some insights from it, and you're joining in prayer with others from around the world, proclaiming Christ faithfully. We're with Joshua is with us here now as well from Uganda, and we're happy for him to be here. So I have just put up on the Facebook page links to the Holy Matrimony presentation booklet, the Contending Anglican, as well the Stephen's Witness. I couldn't find your book, your most recent book. Where is that found, Dr. Noll?
It's under Anglican House Publishers. You look under Global. It actually,
Okay.
my earlier book is also there. They're all under Anglican House Publishers.
Okay, and tell me, what is the focus again on that? When you said it, but I just want to reinforce it again. What was it, the focus on that book itself?
The Gospel of God and the Church of God?
Yes.
I think in some ways I'm arguing that the Gafcon movement is a coherent Anglican theological movement. It's not just a lot of disparate people, but it has a foundation. And in some ways, the foundation is just the basic Christian foundation. In some ways, it's the basic Anglican foundation, going back to the articles and to the prayer book. But we are claiming that in some senses, we are the legitimate heirs of contemporary Anglicanism, especially in the global world.
Wow, and that's in different regions and different countries, it's thornier than others, isn't it?
Very true.
But go ahead, Joshua.
Yeah, Professor Noll, thank you for the resources. I was actually going to ask where to find them, and Arnie, you just did a great thing immediately. And Professor Noll, I'm just thinking about this, the marriage issue, and there are many issues that the world is embracing according to marriage. And I realize that the marriage institution is under attack from all corners, all angles. Everyone is attacking the union. And in the West, it would be homosexuality. But even in Uganda or in Africa setting, there is polygamy, and there's so many issues around it. Why do you think marriage would be a contention issue?
Well, I think that in terms of the Western modernity and postmodernism, there has been, to some extent, an attack on Christianity wholesale with a denial of biblical authority. I mean, that's where it all began at what we call the Enlightenment, questioning whether the Bible really was the Word of God and therefore could be authoritative. But I think beyond that, people have questioned what we might call just fundamental human realities, what it means, for instance, to be male and female. Now that, number one, that's clear in the Bible, but it's also clear to most people. I think in the global South still, people say, yes, of course, you know, you're a boy, you're a girl, you're a man, you're a woman. But there's actually been a philosophical attack in the West on the very idea of what they call, you know, bipolar male and femaleness. And so that's led, of course, the whole LGBT thing, which not only had to do with your affections, your desires, but even your identity. And one of the saddest things in these last 10 years really is called, you know, transgenderism, in which a man or a woman decides actually they're not male or female, they're the opposite. And that leads to tremendous sadness and damage, particularly when it's applied to children. I don't even want to go into the brutal things that are now being done in the name of this new philosophy. So it's a worldview issue. And I think that the global South has been coming from a more traditional perspective.
Sure.
But it's being influenced now through Western communications, the internet, and then also to some extent through governments, because some of the Western governments are tying their aid money to changing, you know, the practices and the views of people in the global South. So it can be a very dangerous sort of temptation to take money with strings attached.
Mm. And I think it's very dangerous for the young generation looking at the poverty levels and the malnutrition, lack of food and stuff. And so when this kind of aid comes, the youth are carried away and we can lose a whole generation just because of that. So I think it's important to have the church rise up to the occasion and having people like Dr. Noll who can stand out. Because when you have a voice, then you have the listenership. If you don't have a voice, you don't have no listenership sometimes. And so it's important. And for the young generation, I was talking to a young lady last week in Mbarara. Annie, you remember Mbarara?
Yes.
I was talking to a young lady there, and she said that she would prefer to remain single because marriage is full of responsibility. She said, when I am alone, I do not have to worry about anyone. I do what I want, I go wherever I want, and I am not concerned about it. And she told me, you're here, but you're worried about your wife back home. You're worried about your home. And so for me, I want to stay single much longer than possible.
Yes.
So how can marriage be appreciated by the young generation?
Mm.
Well, I do think from my time in Uganda, one of the tensions on young, educated people is the desire for further education and the desire to marry and have children. Let's be honest, those can be a tension. I will say, one of the successes we had at UCU was that people desperately wanted a good education. It was also Christian. But for some, it was the desire for the good education. In fact, education sometimes was almost like an idol. And so if a young person or couple puts off having children until they both have their master's degrees, their PhDs, they're going to be toward the end of their childbearing years. Now, I understand that tension, but I do think that that is a matter which they need to talk about earlier. In my case, and we were not that unusual for our own age, but I think now in the current Western generation, we were actually married when we were 21 years old. We actually had one more year to go at university. And then my wife went through 3 seminary years with me, theological college. And then after we had our first 3 children, we went back to England for a PhD. Now, granted, that's easier to say if you're in the West and you have some financial resources. It's harder to do. And if you're getting offers like you can get a scholarship to go to England or the United States and get a degree, well, you go away for 6 years and come back, maybe not married, or maybe your wife stays home. It's harder, but still, I think, God's primary call is to marry and have children. And becoming a professional success is a good thing, but it's not necessarily the thing for everyone. And sometimes you have to make decisions. In my case, I'll give you this example. We have 5 children, and we had our first 4 fairly logically every 2 years. By the time we were both 35, we actually had 4 children, and my wife was thinking of going back to get a PhD because she, as you may know, taught English and is actually very good at that. And she could have gotten a PhD in English. But suddenly we had a surprise. Number 5 was coming along 4 years later. And we prayed about it and we talked seriously about it. And she said, I don't think I should do both. So she withdrew from the PhD program. She taught part-time at a local college for almost all of those years, but she never became a professor because we had decided that our family was more important than that.
That's wow. You're that type of story. It's about sacrifice is what is a key to part of that story. And it's interesting. We had some discussions the other day with some family members and friends who are, well, in the West, it's being pushed up further and further. You often hear people in the West say, well, when I get my degree, or when I get established in a job, or when I get established in a location, after I have a dog, a year or two with a dog, and get used to what it's like, and you just get this kicking it down the road, and then all of a sudden they're 37 and the biological clock is ticking, and that's starting to get late. And so you are seeing the population in the United States for the first time. It's actually going down. It had remained stable or going up, which was a rarity for a developed nation. And so speak to that. I mean, what is the difference in worldview that we're seeing there of this? Well, when it's the perfect timing, we'll get married and then have children, as opposed to what we would call the bit more biblical worldview of what it means to be married. What are we looking at as far as a difference there?
Well, one thing that I will say when we get to the next week, the purposes of marriage, the first purpose that is mentioned in the prayer book is the procreation of children and their nurture in the love of the Lord. And in most times in history and society, that has been more or less obvious, but it's not so obvious today. And there is an alternative vision of a kind of romantic marriage where people fall in love, get married, have sex, and say, but we don't want to bother with children. And that is contrary, I think, to the biblical vision. Now, I think there are exceptions to that. Obviously, the difficult case of people who can't have children, who try and for one reason or another they're unable. Perhaps they can adopt. There may be other special circumstances, but I think they're rare when a couple would actually choose not to have children. So one of the interesting things in the ACNA service is that the couple actually signed something called the Declaration of Intention. And in the Declaration of Intention, it says, we desire to receive the blessing of holy matrimony. And then it goes on and describes what I call the 4 purposes of marriage, one of which is the procreation of children. And so in the marriage preparation, the couple actually signs this declaration saying that's what we understand marriage to be. So, and I know I may be controversial here, so if a couple had come together and said, we want to get married, but we do not intend to have children, or maybe they even signed a contract, a prenuptial contract, we will not have children, that would be contrary to the Christian and the Anglican understanding of matrimony. And I, for a priest, would say, wait a minute, I'm not sure we can go ahead with this. If you have actually are planning to enter into this denying one of the primary purposes. Now, there are other purposes as well, but this has always been one that the church has upheld. How's that? Joshua, what do you think?
Well, it's phenomenal. It's interesting. I don't know about that situation if it would come here, but when I was in the UK I was there for 3 weeks, and there was a couple. They were worship leaders, and they did not have children. And they're like, well, we just don't want to have children. And in my perspective, I was like, how does that work? But also to take that example of a contract where people sign out and say, yeah, but for this not having children, we'll do without children. I think in Africa, children are a blessing. If you don't have children, if you struggle to have children, it's hard on the people, on the couple themselves, on the families where they come from, on the friends around, and it's a very serious issue. Many people break down, many marriages break up because of children. And so in African setting, it's very, very important. And also it's important for Africans to know that, well, some marriages, actually, we need to learn it. That sometimes it is possible that you will not have children. And when such a thing
Right.
comes, you need to know how to trust God for everything. But not having children as an option, it cannot be an African option, surely. But yeah.
Well, if I could comment, I do think certainly I mentioned the sort of traditional problem sometime in Africa where even by some of the tribal customs, if the wife cannot have children, it's a grounds for divorce. And you can actually send the wife back to her parents as having broken the contract, no matter who's at fault. And I think that is also contrary. That's where we talk about the single life.
Right.
There may be people who are single by not of their own choice. But if I could say one more thing that I observed, although it's true, in my time in Africa, I found that African couples and students were always hoping to have children. But I did see a change in the attitude as to how many children. I think you found that whereas in the traditional village setting, a young girl might marry very young and end up having 6, 8, 10 children. But the students who came to university, if you asked them what size family would you have in mind, would talk about 2, 3, 4 maybe. And some of that was very practical, because if you have to educate students and you want them to go to school and pay school fees all the way through university, you simply can't afford to have 6 or 8 children. So there was a change happening, and I think I think myself, the Anglican Church doesn't require that every sex act result in the conception of a child. But I also worry a bit that this trend could go down as it has in the West. So it's not only 3, now it's 2, now it's 1. Now let's just have a couple dogs. So no, Africans don't like dogs, but you can get used to them. They actually are pretty nice.
Sure. In the African setting, children are much worth. But like you said, the trend is going down. The numbers are reducing. And I would not be surprised if 10, 15 years, you'd hear a couple say, well, we'll have one or we'll adopt, and stuff like that. But yeah, it can be dangerous, especially where you get outnumbered. We're talking politics these days. And if you realize that your people are reduced, you're outnumbered. So someone else can take over your space. And that is also an African idea.
I think if I can speak again, Uganda, but I think it's true in other countries too. They have one of the highest rates of population increase. But it seems to me that this is happening largely at the village level and at the level of what you might call the educated population. They're staying fairly level. And that, I think, is a recipe for social discord later on. And so I don't know exactly how one deals with that politically, but I would at least observe that disparity between the poorer and the wealthier parts of the population can be a problem.
It is.
It's a fascinating, my mind, there's a lot of directions I could go in with that, because there's some, particularly when you're talking about in East Africa, where you have a Muslim population and their birth rate and what the implications of that. However, we're going on about 50 minutes now, and I just want to give you you are listening to people are joining us now to Gafcon's Everyday Global Anglicans. We're with Reverend Dr. Stephen Noll, or Professor Noll, as they say in East Africa, and he is contributing this month, September, to the Gafcon devotion of Lift Up Your Hearts, and it's going to be focused on marriage and singleness. So we encourage you to subscribe to that. I'm also joined by Joshua Sali for the first time, who is in Uganda. The three of us were at the enthronement, weren't we, at Archbishop Stephen Kazimba's enthronement in February. That was right before everything. As a matter of fact, that was the day of his enthronement was when I think they had put out a pronouncement of some kind where you couldn't have large gatherings, and going to the enthronement, we were being sprayed all over the place with sterilizer, and nurses were running around with masks and hats on, and that was crazy at that time. So there, Dr. Noll has his feet squarely in both worlds, has had experience both in the East African context and as well in the U.S. in Pittsburgh. Dr. Noll, you're going to be also wrapping up this series, your September contributions, with angels. And tell me, you're drawing from something, aren't you, for providing those 3 days?
Well, interestingly, I did my PhD thesis on a topic of angels as that was understood by the Dead Sea Scrolls community. You know, when you do a PhD thesis, you have to do all these very narrow topics. So I've never written a great book on angels and the Dead Sea Scrolls, but I did write a book in 1998 called Angels of Light and Powers of Darkness. And it was an attempt to write a biblical theology of angels, all the way from Genesis through Revelation. So that book was published by university. It's now under whip and stock. You can find it on Amazon, Stephen Noll, Angels of Light, Powers of Darkness. So that's always been a little bit of a side interest of mine. And so when I had a couple extra days, and since September 29th is the celebration of Saint Michael and all angels, a lot of people may think that Saint Michael was some sort of a human bishop or something, but actually Saint Michael was an angel, the Holy Michael, and he was the archangel who attacked the dragon in the book of Revelation. So I decided I would take a few days to talk a little bit about the nature of angels according to the Bible and according to the church's understanding.
Wow, you are well-rounded. And just hearing that, I mean, you're so many interests you have and things you write on and different angles. Just tell us a little bit about what you're doing, what fills your days. I guess you have, how many grandchildren do you have with Peggy?
We have 7 grandchildren, and 3 of them actually live with us. We've been very blessed. We've lived in the same house here in Pennsylvania for 40 plus years, and we brought up our children here. Then we went off to Africa for 10 years. But when we came back 10 years ago, we moved right back into our house. And then my daughter, Abby, and her husband, Mark, served on the campus of Uganda Christian University for actually longer than we did, for about 12 years. Mark was the director of the Uganda Studies program, which brought American Christian college students over for a semester abroad. Well, in 2014, they came back from Uganda, and they came back to our house. And so we now share the house. We have a three-generational family with my wife and me, and Mark and Abby, and 3 grandchildren. And our oldest, Daniel, is going to turn 16 2 days from now. And then we have 2 cats and a dog. So it's a full house. But
well, that's not very Western style, is it? That's you brought back with you a very much more of an African.
Yep. Anyway, fortunately, both my wife and my daughter are very wonderful people who can put up with a lot of noise and people bumping around. So I think they deserve most of the credit.
Well, do you have, I think we have gone, we have a few questions here. I wish we could address them. Imba Chukwa, you have asked, excuse me if I pronounce your name wrong, a very good question. Is polygamy a biblical sin? I don't know if in like a couple minutes, we really should be wrapping it up. Do you think you could tackle that one like in a minute or two, Dr. Noll? Let's just challenge you on that.
Obviously, you have polygamy in the Bible, even with heroes like Abraham and Jacob. And I think it is contrary to the teaching of Jesus. I think Jesus, when he said, a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, the two shall become one flesh. Jesus corrected what was a distortion of God's original principle.
Mm.
You can go back, of course, Adam and Eve were monogamous. But then we get in chapter 5, not too many generations later, Lamech takes 2 wives and starts boasting about them. So there we have the birth of polygamy.
Mm.
And so polygamy has been with us in many cultures in many ways. I'd say it's not completely contrary to the biblical view of sexuality, as same-sex marriage would be. But nevertheless, it is not the fullness of what God intends, one man, one woman for life. I don't know, Joshua.
That's
any
pretty
thoughts on
good.
that?
Oh, yeah. It would be that's a great attempt. I was just following when you said it starts with Lamech, and again, it was a man's idea, not necessarily God's idea. God's idea was 1-1. That's why we see when Abraham goes off the road, it becomes a problem until now. So I would say it's not God's idea, even when we see it many times. But also we don't see the Lord strongly condemn it so much, but it's not something that is worth taking on. I know in the West, you would say, oh, I cannot even cope with one, and now you have more than one. How do you handle that?
Ernie, can I have one more little anecdote?
Yes.
So when I was at UCU, we had a number of our staff workers that were in what they call customary marriages, which could be polygamous, but not always are. So what we offered, and I think, Joshua, you might have been there, we had a mass wedding, not a wedding mass, but a mass wedding with 18 couples that were married at the same service. Actually, Bishop Kazimba, who at that time was in Mukono, went off to his diocese, and he began offering weddings, in other words, to formalize under the scripture in the church marriage, which was only partly realized in many of these, often the kind of worker class arrangements called customary marriages.
Fascinating. Well, we are now coming up on a full hour. That just, when Dr. Noll asked how long it'll be, I said, well, we always try and go for 30 minutes to 45, but next thing you know, we look up and it's gone, an hour. Are there any plugs or things that you wanted that I've missed, that you have so much going on that you wanted to share or re-emphasize, Dr. Noll?
Well, as I said, I think my main theme throughout this is that marriage and the single life are ways of following Jesus. I mentioned right at the beginning the German theologian martyr Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He wrote a book called The Cost of Discipleship. And he himself was arrested for his opposition to Hitler. Although he was engaged to be married, he never completed it because he was killed by the Nazis. So following Jesus is what we're all about. And that can take different forms and can have different outcomes.
Well, we are blessed that this month we're digging deep. We're every day just there's what people don't know about the the Lift Up Your Hearts devotions is it's also being read by audio, and then we provide a link when you subscribe to it and you receive that email, you can click on it and you can also get an audio, I don't want to call it a podcast, but an audio recording that you can listen to when you're walking or whatever. So take advantage of that. Dr. Noll reads these devotions as well as the others going forward. And we encourage you to sign up and subscribe to it if you haven't already. The whole purpose of Gafcon is to help equip and strengthen the church to proclaim Christ faithfully. And you should know that it doesn't happen in a vacuum. There are good people in the London office and in Nigeria and Australia, around the world, who are working to make this happen. We have this devotion is sent to me, and then I send it to Juliani Ochoa in Brazil, and she translates it into Portuguese and works with somebody in Spanish. So it all takes work. We ask that you, if you have the ability to support and donate to help this ministry to grow, and it is growing. And we want to thank Dr. Noll for contributing, and making this possible this month. And going forward, this is not the last we're going to hear of Dr. Noll, I can tell you that much. And I hope it's not the last we hear of Joshua. This is a great time to be with Joshua. And this is our first time together. And boy, I sure hope it continues, and in different ways. We're doing lots of new, exciting things. We're working with young Anglicans. That's coming up. You might seeing something happening with that. And we hope that you join us and follow us going forward. Dr. Noll, thank you so much.
Thank you, and good to see you, Joshua.
Thank you.
Blessings on your family, all of your family in the house, including your 2 dachshund dogs. And we pray that you have a great day and great week. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Blessings to you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.